The night was dark, the kind that swallowed every trace of light. A cold wind howled through the dense forest as John gripped the steering wheel of his truck, his knuckles turning white. The road ahead was barely visible, covered in a thin layer of mist that refused to lift. His heart pounded. He was deep in bear country, and his cargo was something that could attract unwanted attention. The truck's engine rumbled, the only sound breaking the eerie silence. He had been warned not to take this route, but he had no choice. Time was against him, and the main road was blocked due to a landslide. As he drove deeper into the wilderness, a strange feeling settled in his chest, a sense of being watched. He glanced at the side mirrors, but there was nothing except the endless darkness of the forest. Suddenly, a shadow moved. It was quick, barely noticeable, but John was sure he saw something. He tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed the accelerator slightly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But then, thump! Something heavy landed on the truck's roof. The entire vehicle shook, and John slammed the brakes, his breath hitching. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. He listened, his ears straining for any sound. Then, scratch! A deep, slow scratch like claws dragging against metal. His stomach twisted. John swallowed hard. "What the hell?" he whispered. Before he could react, a loud growl erupted from above, sending a chill down his spine. His instincts screamed at him to drive, but his body refused to move. Then, bang! Something massive dropped right in front of the truck, illuminated by the dim headlights. A bear. No, not just one. As John's eyes adjusted, he saw at least 5 of them emerging from the darkness, their massive forms surrounding the truck like shadows given life. Their eyes gleamed, reflecting the weak light. He felt his pulse hammering against his ribs as he realized the truth. He was trapped. And then the bear on the roof moved again. This time, it wasn't alone. John's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he sat frozen in the driver's seat. The truck's headlights flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows over the massive forms surrounding him. His fingers hovered over the ignition key, but his mind raced. If he made the wrong move, it could mean his life. The bear in front of the truck was enormous, easily over 1,000 pounds. Its thick fur bristled under the pale moonlight as it took slow, deliberate steps toward the hood. Another bear, slightly smaller but just as intimidating, moved along the side, its massive paws pressing into the dirt with terrifying silence. But the real terror was above him. A deep, guttural sound rumbled from the roof of the truck, followed by the sharp scrape of claws against metal. John's entire body tensed. How many were up there? He could hear heavy breathing and the soft rustle of fur against the steel. The roof creaked under their weight. John knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just sit there. His right hand inched toward the glove compartment where he kept a small handgun. Not that it would do much against a full-grown bear, but maybe the sound would scare them off. Before he could reach it, a powerful thud shook the truck. Someone was trying to open the door. His head snapped to the left, and his stomach clenched. One of the bears was pawing at the handle. "No, no, no," John whispered, his pulse roaring in his ears. The bear's massive claws hooked under the door handle, pulling at it with unsettling ease. John lunged forward, slamming his hand against the lock button just as the handle jerked upward. The bear huffed in frustration, its hot breath fogging up the glass. John barely had a moment to process before a new sound filled the air. A low, strange growl, different from the others. The bears reacted immediately. The one trying to open his door froze. The one on the roof let out a sharp grunt before retreating slightly. Even the massive bear in front of the truck hesitated. John's heart pounded. What just happened? Then he saw it. A figure emerged from the trees. Not a bear, but something different. The shadow moved slowly, deliberately, and as it stepped into the dim headlights, John's breath hitched. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. His clothes were tattered, hanging in loose strips from his body. His hair was long and wild, blending with the thick fur draped over his shoulders. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto John with an intensity that sent chills racing down his spine. The strangest part? The bears listened to him. The moment he appeared, the massive predators stilled, their ears flicking in his direction. He made a low, rumbling sound in his throat, a deep, primal noise that sent vibrations through the air, and the bears obeyed. John watched in stunned silence as the bears slowly backed away, their massive forms retreating into the shadows. Even the one on his roof shifted, leaping off the truck with surprising grace. Within seconds, the deadly pack that had him cornered was gone. But the man, he remained. John's fingers trembled as he reached for the window control, rolling it down just enough to speak. Who are you?" His voice barely came out, a weak whisper against the night. The wild man tilted his head slightly, studying John as if deciding something. Then he took a slow step forward. John's muscles tensed, his fight-or-flight instinct screaming at him to get out of there. But something about this man, this creature, kept him frozen in place. And then the man spoke. His voice was rough, gravelly, as if unused to speech. But the words he said sent a fresh wave of fear down John's spine. "You shouldn't be here." John swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. I didn't mean to. The road was blocked. I had no choice." The man stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled sharply through his nose. His gaze flickered toward the back of the truck and his expression darkened. "What's in there?" he asked. John's breath caught. His cargo. The reason he had taken this risky route in the first place. A sudden realization slammed into him. The bears weren't just attacking at random. They were after what was inside the truck. John's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't let this stranger, or those bears, know what he was transporting. It was too dangerous. He forced himself to shake his head. Just supplies. Food, mostly. The man didn't look convinced. His dark eyes flicked back to John, narrowing slightly. Then, without warning, he took another step forward, placing a single hand on the hood of the truck. John flinched as the man sniffed the air, and then a slow, eerie smile stretched across his face. "You're lying." John's blood turned to ice. Before he could react, the man lifted his head and let out a sound, a low, rumbling growl that didn't sound human at all, and somewhere in the darkness, the bears answered. John's breathing grew shallow as the sound of growls echoed through the trees. The bears were coming back. His grip tightened around the steering wheel, his mind racing. Who was this man? And why were the bears obeying him? The stranger's eerie smile didn't fade. His wild, piercing eyes seemed to look right through John, as if he could read every thought racing through his panicked mind. The air around them felt heavier, charged with something ancient and dangerous. John forced himself to think. He needed to get out of here, fast. His fingers hovered over the gear shift, but the moment he moved, the man raised a hand. "Don't," he said in that same rough, almost inhuman voice. John froze. The growls in the distance grew louder. The bears weren't just coming back, they were closing in. Twigs snapped, heavy paws thudded against the ground. The air filled with deep guttural breaths, the kind that signaled predators preparing to strike. The man took another step closer. John could see the raw power in the way he moved, graceful, controlled, but undeniably wild. His bare feet barely made a sound against the dirt, his ragged clothing blending into the darkness like he belonged to it. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," the man said. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. John's heart pounded. The cargo. His mind screamed at him to lie, to deny everything, but something told him it wouldn't work. This man, whoever he was, already knew the truth. John swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about." The man's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, more like amusement. He exhaled through his nose, a sound that sent another chill down John's spine. "You should leave it behind," the man said, tilting his head toward the back of the truck. "If you don't, you won't make it out of these woods." John's fingers twitched against the gear shift. "I have a job to do." The man sighed, shaking his head. "That job is going to get you killed." Suddenly, a deep, thunderous roar split the air. John's breath caught. That roar was different, deeper, angrier, and much, much bigger than the others. The trees trembled. The ground beneath the truck vibrated. John turned his head just in time to see a massive shadow moving through the trees. His blood ran cold. It was bigger than any bear he had ever seen. Even in the dim light, John could make out its hulking form, a giant towering over the others. Its fur was dark, thick, and matted, its shoulders rolling with raw muscle as it pushed forward. The other bears, the ones that had seemed terrifying just moments ago, parted for it. They stepped aside, lowering their heads in what looked like submission. John's mouth went dry. This wasn't just a bear. It was their leader. The wild man didn't move. If anything, he looked calm. The giant bear let out another low, rumbling growl, its massive paws sinking into the earth. Its breath was visible in the cold night air, curling like mist around its muzzle. Then its deep-set eyes locked onto John. The message was clear: get out, or don't get out at all. John's pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't know what was in the back of the truck. He had been paid not to ask questions. But now, every instinct in his body screamed that whatever he was carrying was not worth dying for. He turned to the man. What's in there?" The wild man didn't answer. He just stared at John, as if waiting for him to figure it out himself. John's hands shook as he reached for the door handle. The moment he moved, the bears tensed, muscles coiling. They were ready to attack. John lifted both hands. "I'm just going to check." The wild man gave the barest nod. Heart-hammering, John slid out of the truck, his boots crunching against the dirt. The massive bear let out a low snort, watching his every move. He took slow, measured steps toward the back of the truck, feeling the weight of a dozen unblinking eyes on him. When he reached the cargo door, his fingers trembled against the latch. He didn't want to open it. A deep, sick feeling churned in his stomach. Why would this wild man be so focused on what was inside? He sucked in a shaky breath and yanked the door open, and then his entire body went cold. Inside the truck was a cage, a steel-barred cage, large enough to fit a full-grown bear, and inside it, something moved. At first he couldn't see clearly. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw fur. Dark brown fur, matted with dirt and streaks of dried blood. A pair of round, terrified eyes blinked up at him from behind the bars. A bear cub. John's stomach twisted. This was what he was transporting. A baby. Before he could react, the giant bear behind him let out a deafening roar. John barely had time to turn before the massive beast charged. John's breath caught in his throat. The giant bear was coming straight for him. Every instinct in his body screamed, "Run!" But his legs refused to move. The ground seemed to shake as the monstrous beast lunged forward, its powerful paws thudding against the dirt. At the very last second, John threw himself to the side, just in time. The bear slammed into the truck with a force that sent metal groaning. The entire vehicle rocked, its tires lifting slightly before slamming back down. John hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his bones. He barely had time to process before another sound reached his ears, the cub whimpering. His head snapped toward the cage. The little bear had curled into a tight ball, its small frame trembling. It was terrified. John's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a wild animal, this was their family. The realization struck him like a punch to the gut. He had been paid to smuggle a stolen bear cub. That's why the bears had attacked. That's why the wild man had tried to warn him, and now he was trapped between an angry mother and the people who had hired him, people who would be expecting him to deliver. John slowly lifted his hands. "Wait, wait, I didn't know!" His voice came out rushed, desperate. The massive bear didn't stop. It turned toward him, lips curling back to reveal razor-sharp teeth. Its deep, rumbling growl sent a shiver straight down John's spine. The wild man stepped forward. "Let the cub go," he said, his voice calm but firm. John's heart pounded. I can't." The man's dark eyes flashed. "Then you die here." The giant bear took another step, its claws digging into the earth. The message was clear: the cub, or his life. John's mind raced. If he released the cub, the people who hired him would come looking for him. And they weren't the kind of people to let things slide. But if he didn't... He swallowed hard, looking between the wild man and the massive bear. His fingers twitched. He couldn't fight. He couldn't run. There was only one choice. With shaking hands, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys, and fumbled to unlock the cage. The moment the lock clicked open, everything changed. The cub hesitated at first, its small body still trembling. But then the wild man made a low, soothing sound, and the cub slowly inched forward. The moment it stepped out, its mother moved. John barely had time to react before the giant bear rushed past him, pushing him aside like he was nothing. It reached the cub in seconds, letting out a soft, deep sound, almost like a purr. The little one responded instantly, nuzzling into her thick fur. John exhaled, his heart still racing. He wasn't dead. The wild man gave a small nod. "Smart choice." John's hands were still trembling. They stole it, didn't they? He didn't need to say who. The man's expression darkened. "Poachers." He spat the word like it was poison. "They take the young, kill the mothers, sell them off to the highest bidder." John felt sick. He had helped them. Even if he hadn't known, he was part of it. The wild man took a step closer. "You should leave." John nodded quickly. Yeah, I'll..." A gunshot ripped through the night. John ducked instinctively as the crack echoed through the trees. The bears roared in anger, and then... voices. "There he is!" John's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. The poachers. They had found him. John's body tensed. The poachers were coming, and they weren't alone. Branches snapped, heavy boots pounded against the dirt, shadows moved between the trees. Then another gunshot split the air. The giant bear roared, its massive body shifting in front of the cub protectively. The other bears bristled, muscles coiling, eyes locked onto the threat approaching from the darkness. John's pulse hammered. He knew these men, ruthless, efficient, and heavily armed. They wouldn't stop until they got what they came for. "Stay back!" one of the voices shouted. John turned his head just in time to see 3 men emerging from the trees. They were dressed in dark hunting gear, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their leader, a thick-set man with a scar down his cheek, held a shotgun in one hand and a cigarette in the other. His cold eyes flicked between John, the bears, and the wild man. Well, he drawled, exhaling smoke. "Looks like someone's got himself a problem." John's stomach clenched. He was the problem. The scarred man nodded toward the truck. "You were supposed to deliver the cargo. Instead, you let it go." His voice turned sharp. "That's bad business, John." John swallowed hard. "I didn't know what was in there." Scarface chuckled darkly. "And now you do." He took a slow step forward. "But that doesn't change a damn thing. You owe us. So either you help us finish the job or..." He raised his shotgun. John's breath caught. "We take you out too." The bears growled in unison. The giant one, the mother, stepped forward, towering over everyone. Her deep, rumbling snarl sent vibrations through the ground. The other bears moved with her, forming a solid wall of muscle and fur. They weren't going to back down. The scarred man didn't look impressed. He smirked, tapping the side of his gun. "You think a few bears scare me?" The wild man finally spoke. "They should." The words were calm, almost a whisper. Then he moved. John barely saw it happen. 1 second, the wild man was beside him. The next, he was gone. And then chaos, a blur of movement. The poacher to Scarface's left suddenly screamed as something slammed into him. The wild man. He moved like a shadow, fluid and precise, striking with terrifying speed. The man's rifle flew out of his hands as he was thrown to the ground. The second poacher turned his gun, but before he could fire, a massive bear charged. John barely had time to react as the poacher was lifted off his feet. The bear's powerful paw struck like a hammer, sending the man flying into a tree with a sickening crunch. Scarface took a step back, gun raised. "You think this scares me?" The giant bear, the mother, let out a roar so loud the trees shook. John flinched, his ears rang. The force of the sound hit like a shockwave. Scarface hesitated. For the first time, his confidence cracked. That was all the time the wild man needed. Within human speed, he closed the distance between them. Scarface barely had time to lift his gun before the wild man struck. A sharp, brutal movement. The shotgun was ripped from his hands and tossed aside. Then, a single, powerful punch. John heard the crunch of bone. Scarface staggered back, blood dripping from his nose. He blinked in shock, his confidence shattered. John saw it in his eyes, fear. Scarface wiped the blood from his face. His hand trembled. Then, with a sharp whistle, he turned and ran. His injured men scrambled after him, disappearing into the trees. John exhaled, his body sagging with exhaustion. His hands still shook. His heartbeat refused to slow down. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the heavy breaths of the bears. The wild man stood still, watching the darkness where the poachers had vanished. His face remained unreadable. John swallowed hard. "Are they coming back?" The wild man didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the giant bear, the mother. Their eyes met. Something silent passed between them, a quiet understanding. Then, slowly, the wild man nodded. And just like that, the tension eased. The giant bear huffed, nudging her cub closer. The little one let out a soft, happy sound. The other bears began to move, shifting back into the shadows. The moment had passed. John released a shaky breath. It was over. He turned to the wild man. Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. His wild, piercing eyes studied John for a long moment. Then he simply said, "I belong here." John frowned. "That's not an answer." The wild man smirked. "It's the only one that matters." John looked back at the bears, the way they moved around him, the way they listened to him. And for the first time, he understood. This man wasn't just living in the wilderness, he was part of it. John exhaled, running a hand down his face. "So, what happens now?" The wild man's expression darkened slightly. "They'll be back." John's stomach twisted. He knew it was true. Poachers didn't just give up. They would return, with more men, more guns, and this time they'd be ready for war. The wild man glanced at the truck. "You should go." John hesitated. "And you?" The man's smirk returned. "We don't run." John looked at the bears one last time, the mother standing tall, the cub finally safe, the wild man fearless. He didn't belong in this world, but they did, and John knew they would fight to protect it. With one last nod, he stepped toward his truck. His hands were steady now as he gripped the door handle. He climbed inside, started the engine. As he pulled away, he took one last look in the mirror. The wild man stood there, watching, unmoving. Behind him, the bears disappeared into the trees, fading into the darkness where they belonged. John pressed down on the gas. He didn't know where he was going next, but one thing was certain. He would never forget what happened that night, and neither would they. John drove in silence. His hands were steady, but his mind was a storm. The night's events replayed in his head. The wild man's speed, the giant bear's roar, the fear in the poacher's eyes when they realized they weren't the kings of this land. He had entered these woods thinking he was in control. But the truth had hit him hard. This wasn't his world. It belonged to them, the bears, the trees, the untamed wild. And he had nearly helped destroy it. John gritted his teeth, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He had spent years doing jobs without asking questions. Money came first. Survival was all that mattered. But tonight, he had seen something different. Loyalty, strength, family. The mother bear had fought for her cub. The wild man had fought for them. And John, he had been stuck in between, a man without a side, until now. His truck rumbled over the uneven dirt road. Soon, he would hit the highway, leaving this place behind. But he knew. He couldn't just forget. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. He already knew who it was. The poachers. They had lost tonight, but men like them never gave up. They would regroup, bring more firepower, hunt down the bears until there was nothing left. John inhaled sharply. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he rolled down the window and threw the phone into the trees. The device vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the wild, just like the man he had left behind. John didn't need to hear their threats. He had made his choice. As he pressed down on the gas, the truck roared forward, leaving a trail of dust behind, and for the first time in years, he felt free. Moral of the story. The wild isn't ours to take, it's ours to protect. Some people think power comes from guns, money, or control, but real strength lies in nature's balance, in the bonds of family, and in those who choose to stand for something greater than themselves. John learned that too late. Will you?